Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Across the United States, there are hundreds of millions of acres of public lands. Indeed, there are more than 500 million acres of federal lands managed by the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, and the National Park Service, just to name the three largest land managers in federal government. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. A majority of those lands, the 245 million acres managed by the BLM and the 193 million acres managed by the Forest Service, are largely managed for multiple use: logging, mining, recreation, and even official wilderness. The National Park Service lands, of course, are primarily managed for conservation of natural resources and enjoyment by you, the visitors. But the Trump administration has an eye on some of those lands for energy development, as well as hard rock mining. To better understand what's at stake under that strategy, we're joined today by Dan Hartinger, the Senior Director of Agency Policy at the Wilderness Society. We'll be back in a minute with Dan.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Hi, Dan. Welcome to The Traveler.
Thanks, Kurt, for having me on. Glad to be here.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to your perspective. As we all know, when President Trump took his second term in office back in January, he sent out a flurry of executive orders and quickly got his Interior Secretary nominee approved, Doug Burgum. And Mr. Burgum sent out his own secretarial orders directing his staff what to do right off the bat. And one of those orders, as I recall, had to do with directing his deputies to look out across the federal landscape and identify areas that could be shrunk, perhaps, or shrunk to allow for energy development. What do you know about that secretarial order?
Yeah. And for your listeners who are less familiar with secretarial orders, I think the easiest way to think about them is they're sort of mini executive orders that come from the secretary and direct the leadership of the department to carry out those orders. What we know is this. On really his first full day in the building, Secretary Burgum prioritized signing secretarial orders to carry out the president's energy dominance agenda. And what those did is they identified a number of rulemakings and regulations that were put in place to protect taxpayers, protect communities, protect clean air and water, as potentially hindering that energy dominance agenda, and also identified a number of places, too, that would be reviewed for possible rescission of those conservation protections, most put in place as a result of public input and public processes, with a very, very short timeline for those deputies to create what they called action plans for considering how to review and rescind those protections. Those action plans were due 15 days after the secretarial orders were completed on the 18th.
Now, Dan, before we go on, Dan, I'm curious. Energy dominance. I mean, didn't the United States already have energy dominance before President Trump's second term started?
I'm so glad you asked that. That's exactly right. The U.S. is at all-time high in terms of oil and gas production. And on day one, despite that, President Trump signed a proclamation establishing a national energy emergency for a non-existent emergency, and defined energy as essentially solely fossil fuel driven energy, leaving out wind and solar. And so when we think of energy dominance, we very much think the way the Trump administration is pursuing it is really code for fossil fuel production above all else, especially when it comes to management of public lands.
So, to achieve energy dominance, and I know Secretary Burgum has talked about drill, baby, drill, the president's mantra. How could we possibly get more energy out of the ground than we've already been getting?
That's exactly right. When you look at energy markets, they're market driven. And so it's all based on the international price of oil. Right now, fossil fuel companies already hold millions of acres of previously issued leases for oil and gas development, and roughly half go unused at any given time. And so simply rolling back conservation protections and opening up new areas to production when the vast majority of our public lands and waters are already open to oil and gas leasing is not really going to have any bearing on production, and certainly won't have any bearing on energy prices because those are driven in international markets.
That's exactly right. Just because the oil companies drill more oil or the gas companies produce more gas, that doesn't mean it's going to benefit the U.S. consumer, does it?
No, and removing conservation protections to take some of our most special places as a nation and newly open them to oil and gas leasing and development certainly won't result in any increased production or price impacts. But what it will do is have really damaging repercussions for those communities and those places that rely on those protections.
So when Mr. Burgum directed his deputies, and I'm kind of curious, are his deputies in place?
Well, there are transition team members, and it spells out who they are. The Senate confirmed deputies are not there yet, although we got a further hint about how the administration is thinking about the management of particularly the Bureau of Land Management when they named the head of the Western Energy Alliance, an advocacy organization of fossil fuel producing companies on public lands, as the nominee for the Bureau of Land Management. But we don't really know much about exactly who's writing these plans or what's in them. And so we felt like at the Wilderness Society, it was important to, in the absence of transparency from the administration, do our best to educate the public about what was at stake. And so we created a map that we launched today when we're recording this February 24th that highlights the places that are specifically threatened with potential rollbacks of conservation protections by these secretarial orders, either named specifically in an executive order or secretarial order, or a class of protection that's called out for special review and potential rollback.
During the first Trump administration, his first Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke took a look at national monument designations going back to President Clinton. Those national monuments established by President Clinton, President George W. Bush, and President Obama, with an eye towards shrinking them. And I forget how many recommendations Mr. Zinke made, but the president only really changed two monuments, Grand Staircase Escalante in Utah, as well as Bears Ears in Utah. And I believe he cut a combined 2 million acres off of both of those national monuments. Of course, when President Biden got elected, he reversed those boundary changes and restored the original ones. Mr. Burgum, if you'll correct me, didn't put a timeline on what monuments his deputy should look at, did he? He basically said all federal lands, all national monuments, exactly.
Yeah, and I think in the absence of information, we have to make some educated guesses based on what we suspect may be the case. I think it's important before I get to the content to highlight the approach they're taking too. While we vehemently disagreed with the outcome of Secretary Zinke's approach to the Monuments Review, and we certainly don't believe he listened to the public input, which was overwhelmingly opposed to rolling back any national monument protections, there was a public comment period. There was parameters for the kinds of monuments they were reviewing. And this time around, the secretarial order notably never uses the word national monuments. Instead, it refers to withdrawals under 5 USC 30201, which is the U.S. Code portion for the Antiquities Act. And so it is perhaps notable that the secretarial order omits the words national monument, and that likewise there's no interest or role for public input or public meetings or any kind of opportunity for the communities that have sought protections for these places, in some cases for decades, to weigh in on this. We also don't know how they're evaluating them. Is it just what value they have for oil and gas or coal or other fossil fuel interest? Is it based on the whims of those doing the review? It's very unclear how they're conducting this review or how they're thinking about it.
Now, I've been told, and I don't know if it's right, maybe you can set it straight for me, that the president cannot change the boundaries of a congressionally designated national monument.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And while President Trump attempted to roll back protections for Grand Staircase and Bears Ears national monuments during his first term, as well as Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument off the coast of New England, we think the Antiquities Act is very clear that while the president may designate, only Congress can revoke or rescind. So we don't think the president can roll back protections for either. However, the review certainly does not indicate that that opinion is shared by the administration, because they're actively considering rescissions to presidentially designated national monuments. And our map includes the locations and data on all active presidentially designated monuments, excepting those that were later ratified or increased in protection by Congress, because it's notable that I like to say the Antiquities Act is our nation's most important conservation law that almost no one has heard of. And nearly half of our national parks first began as national monuments designated by a president under the Antiquities Act. So we excluded, of course, those that have been converted to national parks or others. But yeah, it's quite an array of special places that are potentially on the chopping block here.
Now, we're going to try and post that map on the Traveler along with the story of our conversation today. Where else can folks find that map if they want to take a look?
You can go to wilderness.org/Trump map, and that'll include our interactive map and some background information about the secretarial orders and what's potentially at risk, as well as some on the national monuments, specifically some data on the aggregate conservation value they provide in terms of acres of wildlife habitat, miles of streams and rivers, drinking water, and other values they provide to communities.
Now, I'm wondering, in the introduction, I mentioned looking at lands for energy development, but that's not all that they're looking for, is it? I mean, when Secretary Zinke came out with his recommendations, he named Katahdin Woods and Water and I believe Castle Mountains national monuments to allow for logging inside those national monuments. Have you guys kept an eye on that as well, on what other uses they might be looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely something we're paying attention to. And I think it's not always easy to separate the sort of ideological driver against any conservation protections from the the business interests here. So some of the places under review, both national monuments and otherwise, are ones that are threatened by logging or hard rock mining, as in addition to or separate from oil and gas or coal mining. But that's something we're definitely paying attention to and tracking. One place that is threatened by logging, not a national monument, but is called out in one of the executive orders, is the Tongass National Forest in southeast Alaska. Where they're eyeing rolling back protections for roadless areas in the national forest there.
It almost feels like a game of political ping pong. What President Trump tried to do in his first term, President Biden undid during his term. President Trump seems to be coming back to finish up what he tried to do in his first term. I know there's a lot of expectations that he'll zero in on Bears Ears and Grand Staircase in Utah, of course. There's also talk, isn't there, about looking towards the Boundary Waters canoe area for some hard rock mining nearby that could impact that area.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the fear, and we're hopeful that there's still time for the administration to change their mind. But based on what is drafted in Project 2025, which President Trump distanced himself from on the campaign trail, but certainly the early actions in the administration mirror, we certainly believe those monuments in Utah are among the most targeted and threatened, as well as protections for the Boundary Waters, our nation's most visited wilderness area, and where protections from mining are critical to protect that pristine water and other resources up there.
I know a lot of people would say, well, we don't understand what the big uproar is. I mean, we need energy. These businesses put people to work. They generate tax dollars. They put paychecks in people's wallets. What's to worry about?
As a nation, we have for a long time believed that our public lands are an endowment for future generations, that they are more than just assets on a balance sheet. They are where we get our drinking water, clean air, where we go to spend time in nature with our family and loved ones, where we challenge ourselves, where we connect with our history or honor the stories of all Americans. And so this isn't about whether or how we power our country or the policies around that. It's about protecting the places that matter so that future generations can continue to enjoy them. Right now, our public lands, the vast majority of Bureau of Land Management lands are already open oil and gas leasing. We're producing oil and gas at a record high. We do not need to risk destroying these places in order to produce the energy we need. And frankly, in light of the climate crisis, we should be focusing on growing clean energy and emissions-free energy, so that we do not continue to see these huge wildfires and other threats from the climate crisis that are already impacting communities.
At the same time, there are politicians in Utah and in Wyoming who would disagree about the federal government owning so much public lands. They say that they're at a disadvantage compared to, say, Pennsylvania or New Jersey or Virginia, where there are fewer public lands and more private interest benefiting from those lands.
We like to talk about our public lands in terms of values, which in many cases are water, wildlife, and way of life. And particularly in the West, where public lands thankfully are abundant and in many cases protected, those wide open spaces and wildlife habitat and recreation trails are what make living in the West so enjoyable and make recreation easy to access. And so it's not surprising that efforts to transfer or sell off public lands are incredibly unpopular, including in many of those same states you just named. I won't need to get into the lack of merits on the legal arguments there at work, but they fly in the face of well over 50 years and in some cases century of public land law. The Congress is the one that makes the laws about our public lands, and the American people are pretty clear. They want to see them safeguarded for future generations.
These public lands hold more than just recreational pursuits for Americans, right? I mean, we're talking places that provide incredible natural habitat for wildlife, places that clean our air and clean our water. That's incredibly valuable as well.
Absolutely. We looked at just the national monuments alone of the places that are threatened by the secretarial order, and the drinking water of 2.4 million Americans is safeguarded by those places. We're talking about thousands of miles of streams and rivers that are protected by them, millions of acres of wildlife habitat. The values of our public land are much more than the short-term economic value that could be generated from developing them one time. Not to mention the cultural ties and in many cases spiritual and sacred aspects of them. In Bears Ears, nearly 100,000 cultural resources and archaeological sites are throughout Bears Ears. I've been lucky enough to be there several times, and you almost can't walk down a single canyon there without seeing the evidence of thousands of years of history and habitation. And so the idea that these places are only valued by what they can create in profit for private extractive companies, I think flies in the face of nearly anyone who goes out and experiences them.
Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the Songus National Forest up in Alaska, and that's probably not the only place at risk of change in management, is it? I mean, we've got the Ambler Road proposal that I believe the Trump administration, the first time around, approved, and then the Biden administration put a halt to it. That, of course, is a 211-mile road that would cut across parts of Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve, and I believe the Noatak Wild River to reach what is believed to be a world-class copper deposit near the small town of Ambler, Alaska. And then there's also the Pebble Mine. I'm wondering if we're going to see that resurrected again. What can you tell us about those two projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are very concerned that combined with the efforts that the administration is also pursuing to limit and undermine adequate environmental analyses under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, we will see those kinds of projects rush through with minimal review. The Bristol Bay one is interesting. I think speaks a little bit to some of the transactional nature of how President Trump often approaches these things.
And that's connected with the Pebble operation, right? Or the
yes,
Pebble proposal.
with Pebble Mine proposal. In the first term, President Trump, among the very few conservation issues he was on the right side of, in my opinion, actually, the administration was a little all over the place, but did take some steps to limit that and pause it. With reporting, I think, finding that it was largely because Donald Trump Jr. enjoys fishing up there. And so who knows what that will mean this time around. I think we are very much anything is on the table given the administration's posture towards mineral extraction as the dominant use of all public lands.
Yeah, it's going to be curious watching things go forward. I want to backtrack a little bit back to the potential threat that national monuments face. Now, you go back to 2017 when President Trump, during his first term, issued the executive order to shrink the boundaries of Grand Staircase and Bears Ears national monuments. A number of conservation organizations filed suit challenging the president's authority to shrink a national monument's boundaries. To the best of my knowledge, that suit is still pending in U.S. District Court in District of Columbia. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, that case has not been resolved yet and is still pending. And so, not wanting to speak to anyone or get too far ahead, but those cases could become relevant again if we see the president attempt to once again roll back protections for Bears Ears and Grand Staircase.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, any idea? I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not sure if you're a lawyer or not, but any idea what needs to be done to reactivate those cases? I mean, it seems like they're just pending.
Yeah, I'm not an attorney, but I know in speaking with our attorneys, there have been discussions about if and how to reactivate those cases. And so I think we at the Wilderness Society, as well as all of our partners in conservation NGOs, and also following the leadership of the tribes on the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, will weigh all of our options in terms of how to sufficiently ensure these places remain protected, including potential litigation.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious. One of the interesting tangents associated with these cases, and interesting from the perspective of somebody who follows news, is Chief Justice John Roberts of the Supreme Court had indicated an interest in perhaps entertaining the question of how big national monuments can be. And of course, that stems from a lawsuit commercial fisheries businesses brought against President Obama's designation of a national monument off the coast of New England. Any concerns that that might creep up and reach the Supreme Court?
There's always concerns, particularly given some of the shifts we've seen in legal doctrine at both the Supreme Court and throughout the judicial system. However, both recent and past monuments have been incredibly thoroughly vetted, not just through community input, but in terms of rigorous documentation of the historic and scientific importance of the objects that the monuments are designed to protect, and the density and location geographies of these objects. And so, we feel strongly that the case, whether it comes to Bears Ears or Grand Staircase or others, is incredibly clear that, in meeting the bar for the Antiquities Act, the objects are both scientifically important and of more than sufficient density to justify the boundaries. We've seen past precedent. The courts have had broad deference to the president's discretion in terms of what constitutes the smallest area compatible when it comes to designation of a monument. Now, Chief Justice Roberts indicated he was potentially interested in seeing that reviewed, but we feel very strongly that the documentation is there from the scientific and cultural resource and other values that they were designed to protect.
And of course, it can't be overlooked that, as you mentioned earlier, Grand Canyon National Park started out as a national monument that was quite a bit smaller than today's national park, which might be pointed to as evidence for, it should have been a larger national monument.
Yeah. Yeah. It was, that was one of the original cases regarding the Antiquities Act to make it to the Supreme Court, where, in history, echoing, I suppose, opponents of the monument tried to claim that the Grand Canyon itself was not an object of scientific importance, nor was it the smallest area compatible. And the Supreme Court soundly rejected that series of arguments. But that's, I'd say, much the same series of arguments that we're seeing, although with, sort of different trappings this time around in trying to, in seeking to overturn monuments like Grand Staircase or Bears Ears or others. So the history, I think, is on our side. The public support is on our side, is on the side of national monuments, and we will do our level best to ensure that the law remains on our side as well.
Yeah, now, earlier in talking about Bears Ears, you mentioned tribal support for its establishment and the boundaries that were set for it. You go down south to New Mexico and Chaco Culture National Historical Park. Again, we're ping-ponging over administrations, whether or not to allow oil and gas leasing. The latest volley by President Biden was to set a moratorium, I believe, around 10 miles, within 10 miles of the National Historical Park. And I'm guessing that's going to, I think Project 2025 called for that to be reversed again. And I think the Navajo Nation was concerned about that buffer zone. No, I mean, how do you measure tribal support for or against a national monument or national park or oil and gas moratorium?
Yeah, that's an incredibly complicated question. I think first and foremost, I'd stress that as an organization, the Wilderness Society has the utmost respect for and value of tribal sovereignty and their tribes' nation and nation relationship with the federal government. And so I won't pretend to speak on behalf of the Navajo Nation, but my understanding is the same as yours, that the Navajo Nation did raise concerns with that withdrawal. On the other side of the equation, the All Pueblo Council of Governors, which represents the 19 Pueblo tribes and nations of largely New Mexico, have been actively supporting and pushing for that withdrawal for some time. And the 10-mile buffer zone represents, in fact, a compromise from prior proposals. So it's an incredibly difficult question. You know, certainly Secretary Holland, or prior Secretary Holland, has needed to weigh and balance all the public input, consultation with all the tribes, both the Pueblos and the Navajo Nation, and ultimately had to make a determination about what was in the best interest of preserving public lands and the cultural resources that were threatened. I think it's important. The Biden administration also did make sure to clarify that there's a sort of, your listeners may be familiar with, much of our public lands are what's called checkerboard pattern, where there's parcels of privately held or state trust land, or in this case, private lands owned by Alatis, Navajo Alatis within the withdrawal area. The withdrawal only applies to new leasing within the boundaries of federal land, so it does not impact the ability of Navajo Nation Alatis to lease out their own private lands, which was part of the concern. So it's always a tricky situation when you're balancing the interests of tribes versus another. But I think if there's anyone who's able and demonstrated to value tribal sovereignty and balance, it's former Secretary Deb Haaland.
Now, to jump to another area of the West, let's go to southwestern Wyoming and the Red Desert area up there. A phenomenal place of public lands. I could go into some of the details there, but I don't want to reveal everything that could be found up there in the Red Desert. But certainly, it's got a lot of cultural history. It's got a lot of wildlife resources. I think the longest migratory passage in North America ends in the Red Desert, between the Red Desert and up by Grand Teton National Park, the antelope that make that migration every year. During the Biden administration, the Bureau of Land Management, which oversees the Red Desert, had approved a resource management plan to try and balance, as much as it sought fit, recreation and development and whatnot. Is that under the crosshairs of the Trump administration?
Yes, that's one of the resource management plans that's specifically highlighted by name in Secretary Burgum's secretarial order. So we are very concerned that's potentially a target to roll back those conservation protections. You're absolutely right. It's the site of the longest annual land migration of big game in the U.S. in the lower 48, 160-mile route that elk, pronghorn, and mule deer all used across the Red Desert. And that resource management plan that was finalized includes protections for those migration corridors and other critical cultural resources and wildlife habitats. So we certainly hope it will remain intact, but early signs are troubling in that it was specifically called out in the secretarial order for review and possible revocation or change.
I know there was some concern that if he won a second term, which he did, President Trump and his team would come in a lot more laser focused on what they wanted to do and have a strategy for implementing it. How do we bring an end to this game of political ping pong where differing administrations reverse what the previous administration did? Is it possible?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think we've seen that historically speaking, this is not the norm, right? There have been it is when you zoom out and look at the historical view, conservation protections nearly always grow in popularity over time. And so, looking back, you mentioned Grand Teton. That was in its day controversial when FDR designated that the then Jackson Hole National Monument. There was a backlash from some of the Wyoming elected officials. Now, it's the focus of ads about the importance of recreation and tourism to Wyoming, and sort of front and center in those kinds of campaigns. And so, if you look at, there has been some element of a political football between presidential administrations, but what isn't true is that there's a political football among the American people. Polling is incredibly consistent about the public's view of public lands, and so it's on all of us to try and talk to our elected officials and the agencies that manage the lands on behalf of the people, and encourage them to have management reflect that public sentiment. Um, I'd also note that we have seen on national monuments specifically an attempt to have this ping pong effect. We don't believe the president has the authority to roll those back; only Congress does, and it's notable that Congress has the authority to revoke national monument protections and has only used it roughly a dozen times in the over a century of history there. I think largely because it's not particularly popular to take special places and remove their protections and open them up to development. So how do we change this? I think it's through the engagement of the public. Not to sound like a clip from The West Wing, but I think nothing in our system, nothing is stronger than the people. And so I think part of our hope in putting out this map and making sure that in the absence of transparency from the administration, we were doing everything we could to educate the public, because in the light of day, these actions, if taken, are not popular. And I think we saw that in the first administration, that the National Monuments Review was unprecedented, unpopular, and we believe illegal. And we'll be doing everything we can to make sure that the public is educated and able to weigh in on these actions, and hopefully we have management that reflects the strong public support for conservation.
I'm just wondering, though, whether this administration cares about public opinion. Just the other week, there was the annual Conservation in the West poll conducted by Colorado College. It was the 15th annual poll. It showed overwhelmingly strong support for conservation of landscapes over oil and energy development. And yet, the Western delegations from Utah, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming don't seem fazed by that polling. There's a lot of outcry over how the federal workforce was downsized indiscriminately by Elon Musk. The president made jokes about that. He made jokes about the people complaining about it. Will public sentiment really matter to this administration?
Yeah, I don't know that I can say whether public sentiment matters to the president or his appointees. I think we know he is sensitive to how he's portrayed in the press, but whether that will ultimately win the day on their actions, I don't know. What I do know is that members of Congress and state and local elected officials, unlike President Trump, who is not eligible to run again, do have to listen to the public who elected them, and in many cases will be weighing their options in the future. And so, yes, there has not been sort of a dam bursting moment in terms of separating from President Trump's energy dominance agenda. However, if you look at some of the unease with the mass firings of federal employees, as members were hearing about it from their constituents at town halls over the last week, or if you take former Secretary Ryan Zinke, now Congressman Ryan Zinke from Montana, it's no secret that we disagreed with much of what he did as secretary at the Wilderness Society. We did, at least. However, he is someone who recognized that the idea of selling off public lands is incredibly unpopular. And so when reporting came out that there were discussions about making federal land sell-offs part of the budget reconciliation process. I think recognizing that unpopularity and his own view on this, he came out strongly and said, "I'll be a no on any bill that includes public land sell-off." And so there are issues where, even in the face of a relatively unified front from the Trump administration on energy dominance, where speaking up and ensuring that Congress and state and local elected officials are aware of how unpopular things are does truly make a difference. And advocacy only doesn't make a difference until it does, right? And so sticking with it and keeping an eye on the long run is important as well.
Yeah, I believe Congressman Zinke actually introduced legislation to prohibit the selling of any federal lands.
Yeah, he introduced a bipartisan bill with Congressman Gabe Vasquez of New Mexico, Public Lands and Public Hands Act, to prohibit the sell-off of broad parcels of public lands, which is a great step.
That's Dan Hartinger, the Senior Director of Agency Policy at the Wilderness Society. Dan, thanks so much for joining me today. It's been an interesting and provocative conversation, and it'll be interesting to see how things move forward and what Interior Secretary Burgum recommends to the President in terms of where to drill, baby.
We will be eyeing that as well. Thank you for having me, Kurt.
That's our show for this week. I hope you found it informative. There are a lot of moving pieces at stake with the new administration when it comes to public lands management, and here at The Traveler, we'll try to keep you on top of them. Our work is made possible through the support of readers and listeners. If you find it valuable, please consider a donation. It makes all the difference in what we can produce. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.